Rachael. I led the creation and curation of the Prejudice and Pride programme at the National Trust in 2017. So I'm going to give you a bit of a tour of the programme, drawn out some of the different methodologies and really just a bit of a menu of the different points of entry that we created at the National Trust into queer heritage, and particularly reflecting on the value of working with creative partners in that and the difference that made to the programme. That's going to take about 15 minutes. And then we're going to move on to Girl, Boy, Child and a discussion with David around that fantastic performance that he created as sort of a legacy out of the Prejudice and Pride programme. And we'll save plenty of time at the end for questions. So please do put questions into the chat function or Q&A function as we go, either for me or for David, and Dan will collate them and draw them out as we go. So this is what we were trying to do with Prejudice and Pride. These were the aims that I kind of wrote for myself as I was trying to wrap my head around what queer programming at the National Trust could be. I can't really overstate how new this was for the organisation. So Sean Curran, who we heard from yesterday, had done some fabulous work at Sutton House in London, but none of the other property teams had really engaged with queer heritage or queer outreach in any way before, and we'd certainly never done anything nationally before. And I suppose one of the lessons that I really take from Prejudice and Pride is that wherever you are, whatever organisation you're in, if the National Trust with very, very little experience, expertise, dedicated resource, with traditionally a very conservative supporter base and huge scrutiny from right-wing press, can do this, wherever you are, you can too, and how it go. And the second point here was really important for me around legacy. So I was very conscious in my desire for this programme to change the organisation, to leave a really fundamental change in it. And so I think for me, no organisation changes and takes genuinely creative steps forward without hearing new voices. And that was incredibly true with Prejudice and Pride. And some of that was internal, and it was about amplifying the voices of the people like you see on the screen now from across the organisation who just put their hands up when I said, I want to do something around queer heritage, and put their hands up and said, I can do that, I've got an idea. And just being able to empower those people internally was incredibly important. But it was also about acknowledging our gaps and our needs and going externally. And we had some fantastic partners that made the programme possible. We worked very, very closely with Richard Sandell and a team at the Research Centre for Museums and Gallery Studies at the University of Leicester. I think Richard will touch on that a bit shortly. And we also worked with a number of artists and creatives, people who not only created fabulous, interesting kind of content for the programme that made the programme possible, but also helped us to look at our collection again in a different way and challenge us to look at the organisation again in a different way, and then supported us to make the changes that needed to be made. So Prejudice and Pride took place across 12 National Trust places. I'm going to very, very briefly touch on 2. This is Kingston Lacey in Dorset. In the early 19th century, it was the home of William John Banks, who was caught in an indecent act with a guardsman in London for the second time and faced prosecution, and had the financial means to escape that and fled to live on the continent for the rest of his life. And a lot of the collection that visitors who come to Kingston Lacey today see are objects that he sent back from his exile. And we'd never told that story. That had never been shared. He might as well have been on holiday for the second half of his life, enjoying the weather in Italy. He also significantly redesigned Kingston Lacey from his exile and sent back these beautiful, meticulous notes and instructions around, the hinges on this door should be hung at this height, and sketches for carvings and that kind of thing. But he could never come back to see the result of his work. And he couldn't come back to see it because had he returned to England and faced prosecution, the penalty he would have faced would have been death at the first half of the 19th century. And we wanted to to just tell the story and weave it in to how we present the collection at Kingston Lacy, but also to create a deeper emotional connection with visitors around this narrative. So we work very closely with RCMG on this project and a team of artists to create installations throughout Kingston Lacy, throughout the house. And this is the first one. This is in memoriam, and it's an installation of 51 robes. Each robe representing the life and death of a man hung for same-sex in William John's lifetime. So to give the kind of the context of his life and the choices that he made, the height of the knot in each rope represents the age of the man at the time of his death, from 17 to 71. An incredibly powerful installation right in the entrance hall. So it set the context for the rest of the visit when it was installed in 2017. It also felt incredibly important to us to not leave acknowledgement of the persecution of queer people in the past as history, something that happened a long time ago. So this is displaced. This was an installation, kind of a very subtle installation in the central window here, film projection, that gave space for voices of queer people today who had been forced to flee their homes and they've been exiled from their homes because of their sexuality or gender identity. We had some people from the UK, but also from around the world, places like Chechnya, Uganda, who also given space here. And I think it was really important in terms of shifting perceptions. So, the range of National Trust visitors who came to Kingston Lacy at this time to help them look again and kind of build empathy. And again, I think Richard might touch on some of that shortly. This brilliant image is of an artist called Tom Marshman, who did a residency at Hanbury Hall in the Midlands. Now, queer heritage didn't run through the collection at Hanbury in the same way that it did at Kingston Lacy. There are some very subtle queer, kind of coded queer connections in a huge mural on the staircase at Hanbury related to Queen Anne and Achilles and Patroclus. Really very easy to miss, very difficult to interpret without help for visitors. And they lost. And so the team worked with Tom Marshman on residency to draw out these very subtle connections into a not so subtle, very playful performance and introduce visitors to them for the same time. And kind of through that residency, really build confidence in the team. So Tom worked with staff and volunteers to just get them to start talking about this hidden history in this mural. Okay, so I was also very keen that the Prejudice and Pride programme and queer heritage touched every function of the National Trust, reach as many teams as possible, and that we created national content that could be accessible to people wherever they lived in the country or world and would outlast the programme. So we worked with some fantastic academics, Alison Oram and Matt Cook, to put together this guidebook. We had Alison yesterday, and we were in a very fortunate position to be able to commission EJ Scott, who we heard from in the same session, as to write and co-host a podcast for us, which is actually still available to download. I wonder if I can just play a short clip of that here.
Hello and welcome to Prejudice and Pride. I'm Claire Balding, and I'll be taking you on a tour of some of the creative, dramatic and surprising histories of National Trust places.
So we've been researching some inspiring stories, some incredibly moving and tragic stories, and just everyday experiences of the people who shaped our places.
The National Trust is brimming with LGBTQ stories and histories. And of course, the Trust's properties and gardens reflect wider British society. So of course, we can find evidence of same-sex love and gender non-conformity in every kind of place.
For me, the strongest legacy of this programme is about people today and about that instinct that we all have to look back to the past and to see ourselves recognised, to see something of ourselves in the way that history is presented.
I'll leave it there. And I think what EJ really helped us to do through the podcast, actually elsewhere in the programme, was to help diversify the past lived experiences that we were able to represent, but also to be really open and honest with our audiences about what we were trying to do, the challenges of exploring, identifying, representing past queer lives, and why we should do that, to talk to our audiences about that in a way we hadn't really with any curated programs before. EJ also was a huge support and helped me in creating the LGBTQ network for staff and volunteers at the National Trust. We had never had a diversity network in the organisation before, and that's a huge legacy from the programme that's run through. We attended 17 Pride festivals in that year, and we've attended at least that many every year since. And you can see the little rainbow oak leaf on a few of these stickers and cards there. And I fought really hard for the creation of the rainbow oak leaf. I think probably a lot of you will understand that the National Trust does not mess around with its brand lightly. And it was an incredibly powerful statement. Many of you will have seen that the programme attracted negative press and right-wing press around the rainbow lanyards, particularly, and the idea of this symbol, this rainbow oak leaf. And I think even though it's a relatively simple symbol and signal of inclusion, these things can be quite powerful, can have a lot of weight with them. So this was one of my favourite projects in the programme. We wanted to go out to communities, and we delivered quite a lot of the programme away from National Trust sites in various cities and within communities. This was a project that we ran with the National Archives, with who we recreated a 1930s queer club in London. So the image that you see at the top here is of the original, a photo that was taken by police during a raid of that space, and the photo at the bottom is our recreation. And they worked with young people to research police records around this persecution of queer people and who tended in queer spaces, and we were able to program it with artists and performers to bring it to life and really explore the loss of queer spaces today. And this is my last little case study. We also went out into communities through Heritage Open Days, which is a volunteer-run festival that takes place every September in England. And I worked very closely with the team there to create some really simple guidance, nudges, and sort of inspiration stuff to encourage volunteers to think about programming queer histories as part of the spaces that they opened that year and beyond. And I think they'd had about 2 LGBTQ queer heritage experiences in the previous decades festival have been running. They had 32 this year, and they've had several again kind of every year since. And I suppose if you are in an organisation where you're looking for space to try and experiment with connections to queer heritage within collections, the Heritage Open Days Festival can really provide an easy sort of tool, a way in to test new ways of working with volunteers to provide access to those collections for free through the festival. And we also worked with fundraised to bring in 4 artists to run kind of deeper participative projects in the community. And this image here is from a project that was looking to explore to sort of build on a series of love letters from between 2 soldiers in World War II. So that's my very quick introductory tour of the programme and some of the different kind of mechanisms that we used. Really want to save quite a bit of time to zoom in on one case study, and that's Girl Boy Child with David, who's here today to talk to us about his experience. So Girl Boy Child was a commission, again in partnership with RCMG and Richard Sandell at the University of Leicester. And we asked David to come in and look through across the queer collections of National Trust, so it wasn't just sort of restricted to one place, and draw out the kind of interesting, resonant, relevant bits to him. And the performance premiered at our conference in 2018 that some of you might have been to, and then toured around National Trust places. And just before we bring David in, I'm going to show a little.
Who we are Over the last couple of years, more museums and galleries have brought out their queer or LGBTQ histories than ever before, which has been fantastic to have that spotlight on hidden or suppressed or silenced histories. But we realise how important they are because at the same time there has been a backlash, a public and press backlash against some of that visibility, and there's been rising hate crime against LGBTQ people, which makes us realise how important it is to tell these stories in these kinds of places today.
Places of heritage, culture can do a lot more for changing behaviours and supporting people to see things differently.
Desire to know, desire. What makes a child a child?
David, I hope you would just start by, that was a bit of a teaser trailer for people about the performance, but just to talk about what the performance was, the kind of look and feel, just to bring it to life a bit for the people who are listening.
What was the performance? The performance was a performance. That was what was requested. Richard said that Richard Sandell, Professor Richard Sandell, sorry, University of Leicester, was collaborating with the National Trust. That was as much as I knew. And he said that he wanted to work with somebody towards creating a performance about LGBT lives lived in National Trust properties. So I thought it was a strange request, but it turned out to be a life-changing one. And it was so much fun because once I said yes, it meant that we had to visit all the properties and speak to the volunteers at the properties and actually go backstage, you know, get behind the scenes, which was which has been a delight because it's always nice to see what's going on. And another thing that was very interesting to me was the diversity of the people working in the National Trust as against on site, because I've had a view of the way that those sites work. And a lot of the work that I've been doing since has been about understanding why there is an issue with Black attendance at these spaces. But what I found interesting and encouraging was that actually across the sector, there was a lot more diversity than I thought, and I wouldn't have known it if I'd done this project. Anyway, I went to, there was a list of LGBT lives that had been lived in national properties, and it turned out that some of them we weren't necessarily supposed to know about, because there were a couple of lives I wanted to explore in the research, and the properties weren't, the sites weren't interested in having that aspect of their history promoted. So, but in the end, I ended up looking at William John Banks, a Regency adventurer, explorer, pilferer, who brought back an Egyptian obelisk, or had an Italian giant, Giovanni Belzoni, bring back an obelisk for him to Kingston Lacy in Dorset. You can see it in the grounds. I hesitate to say that it was my favorite, but there was so much recognizable art there, they offered me a job. Because I was like saying, oh, that's Watteau, oh, that's you know, Rubens, oh, that's Cranach, and stuff like that. But also I was fascinated by his sense of interior design, which was quite profound, I would say, and his skill at marquetry. And then he turned out to be one of the persons who had to flee the country because of his sexuality. At the time, anybody who behaved the way that William John Banks did was considered a scapegrace. But you speak about exile and it takes you to a place of sadness. And my feeling was that it wasn't sad at all, that actually he was liberated to become fully who he was, which was this African adventurer who penetrated Nubia and disguised himself as an Arab so that he could enter Mecca, and going to St. Catherine's and rooting around in the cellars and finding papers and writing letters to people who might have been his objects of his affection, but you can't be sure. And then there was he became the boy of Girl, Boy, Child. And then there was Christabel Marshall, also known as Christopher St. John, which is why I hesitate to say that William was a favorite, because I also loved her. I thought she was amazing. She took a male name. She wrote an incredible text in 1901, which is impossible to get a hold of, called Hunger Heart. The only way, there are photocopies at Small Hythe in Rye, where she lived. But then there are also, there's also a copy at the British Library, which I read, and it was incredible. And it was from day one, from the minute that she was conscious, she knew that there was an issue with the fact that she was gendered. And it was a real issue for her, and she fought it really passionately in her life, and actually found some sort of solace at Small Hythe. And then there was Henry Paget, the Marquis of Anglesey, who lived at Plasnowith. And unfortunately, there wasn't so much evidence of him, because I think that to an extent he'd been erased because of the property was ashamed of him, or the family was ashamed of him and sort of buried his memory. But he made the cover of the Pride and Prejudice National Trust magazine. And in some ways it seems quite tragic, because he passed away at 29, but then life expectancy was less in those days. But what was extraordinary about him was that he just burned through one of the top 10 inheritances in the country. The minute he inherited it, he just went insane and purchased jewels and had his car rigged up to spew perfume, and went on tour because he thought he was an actor, and became a sensation in Germany. He became famous for doing a very liquid butterfly dance. And I became fascinated by these three people. And then I'm talking, aren't I? It's like I'm doing a lecture. I should be letting you ask questions.
Okay,
so that was the girl, boy, child of the title. So I'll stop there, and then you can.
That's okay. I was. It's funny that you sort of end on Henry Paget there, because we had a brief conversation the other day about some of the challenges of relating to some of these uber posh, very wealthy white people who lived in these big stately homes. And one of the things I really took from Girl, Boy, Child that we were discussing was, of all the sort of people we talked about in the programme, I think Henry Paget was the one that I struggled most to kind of connect with and to have that kind of empathy with, until Girl, Boy, Child. So I wondered if you could talk a bit about kind of finding ways in to relate to these kind of histories, and then how you make them relatable for wider audiences.
The approach was to find out as much about them as possible, and if there were any barriers to approximate. So with William John Banks, I heard the story, heard about the scandal, and there were two books, one by Anne Seber, and the other one was by Patricia Usick, Adventures in Egypt and the Exiled Collector. And there's one section. Actually, I'll find it for you because I have the text in front of me. one that the audience found particularly gigglesome, shall we say. But it was, whilst I was doing the research, I noticed that he was writing these really descriptive, florid letters about looking at buildings and looking at architecture and discovering statues and finding things that he'd always hoped he might. And it seemed to me that he was writing all of these letters to men that he'd spent time with on his expeditions, and that you know, potentially there could be some sort of romantic code. So I came up with this idea of a woman at a dinner party who had attended a dinner party recounting her experience of meeting William John Banks. And at one point, I worked with that idea of the description of architecture being a kind of a flirtation. So thereby I got to, I enjoy a micro-architecture that is well proportioned. I took sensual pains to form pleasing trefoils and sexpartite ribs with foliated bosses, flying buttresses and gold leaf diapering. English Gothic is our finest architecture, is it not? And that's him having a conversation with a dashing young conscript without actually saying, you know. But when I performed it, there were lots of giggles in the audience. And then in the case of Henry Cyril Paget, there was an opportunity to actually voice an interview that he did with the Daily Mail in the around about 1904-5 when he died. And what was interesting about it was that lots of the professionals who heard Girl, Boy, Child for the first time recognized the article, but they'd never actually heard or thought about it that way. And what we know about him is that he died young from pleurisy. So I voiced it and intoned it as if though he was actually on the verge of passing. One of the things that was interesting about him was this idea that he lived in Paris with the sister-in-law of a famous actor. And I just needed to find descriptions of what the theatre was like in Paris in about 1875, 1886, when he was there, before he returned to Wales to live in the family pile. And I couldn't find anything. So I did find out that Henry James was around at the same time. And I found a really lavish description by Henry James of the theatre. And then I also read about Sarah Bernhardt in Paris and a description of her dressing room. And all of these became devices by which I could flesh out the ambience, the atmosphere that was around him. And just the idea of somebody who had been a child growing up around the theatre in Paris and then suddenly finding themselves alone at this magnificent Welsh manor, and then inheriting a fortune. It's pot noodle psychology, but you can begin to kind of put together a character. What was really amusing was that an academic visited when we did the performance at Kingston Lacey, and she said, "David, I'm so sorry to have to tell you this, but because whilst I was voicing his guardian, I was speaking as if the way was a French woman." But it turned out that she was Australian. And I spoke to Richard Sandell about it, and I said, "Oh God, Richard, do you think I should do it differently?" And he said, "No, don't change a thing." And at that point, I began to appreciate and understand why it is that a lot of the adaptations that I've complained about in cinema, because they're inaccurate, and then they have this excuse of, yes, but it doesn't work. You know, I was in a situation where I was deciding that the French accent was more effective than the Australian accent. But just having an eye for that detail, I think works really well.
Yeah, and I think it was lovely to have your voice woven through their voices. You give a lot of space to actually their voices in the performance. I wondered if you could just touch a bit on what you think, particularly working with artists, brings for museums and galleries and heritage sites looking to kind of give more space to this kind of past queer lives?
Well, I wasn't sure what I was going to do, but in the end, I just did what I know, and that was my skill. Because of the pop background, is pinning words to music. So there's a tune. What lyric? Which words will you place where, and how will you voice them? How will you tune them? And so I just had the idea of tone poems. So I found a quadlibet by a Welsh composer called Alan Hodinott, who I sought out because I had a Welsh character, so to speak. And then another one called Grace Williams and George Butterworth. And I used tone poems by then, which are pieces of music that are about 10 or 12 minutes long. And then I found a French composer called Germaine Taillefer, and she was one of the famous 6 composers, but she wrote these beautiful little 3-minute suites for 2 pianos. And those were the pieces of music that I wrote songs to. But for the tone poems, I used spoken word. And so then you cram yourself, your head full of all the information, ask all the questions, pursue the avenues, find whatever you can. And then I was in a situation where I had pages of notes about a character just pinned to the wall. And I'd listen to the music and start adapting from that. So Girl, Boy, Child was divided into 4 chapters. It was childhood, juvenescence, scandal, and the conclusion, roughly. So I decided that because these tone poems are long enough to have movements, that I would give each character that I was writing about a movement. And so I thought, okay, let's and then something about their relationships with the mothers in their lives really spoke to me. So I made the first section, which was the childhood section, about the women who raised them, speaking about them as children. And then I carried on that same way. Sometimes they spoke for themselves, and sometimes people encountered them. In the case of William John Banks, just before he is exiled, I created a section to the first movement of Grace Williams's Sea Sketches, where it's gentlemen in a club being like massively homophobic in posh English accents. And then as the movement changes, a more sober individual emerged from the chatter to say, but actually, if you think about it, he's going to Ibiza, he's going to Sardinia, he's going further southeast, he's going to Egypt, he's going to Africa, he's going to be speaking in languages and walking in Mecca and going into the bowels of old monasteries and living his best life. And that was great. And so that was great. And then for the final section, I found this really beautiful sort of cyclical mesmeric work by George Butterworth. And I started applying the words to that, but none of my research worked. And I thought the best thing to do would actually be to use their voices. So I used the language from William's letters. And I used what Henry Cyril Paget said in the Daily Mail interview, and I actually used the words from Hunger Heart. So throughout, it was my response to the research until I got to that point, and then I let the characters, as it were, speak for themselves through me.
It had a fantastic legacy, I think, especially at Plas Newydd, well, all the places that host it, but especially the team there, who had been one of the teams who were hesitant about programming Prejudice and Pride content in 2017. They didn't, they weren't quite as confident with the collective connections there, the stories, and then actually it was through this project that they began to look at it in more detail and then kind of host uni performance in 2018. So it's brilliant. I wonder, Dan, if there are any other questions or anything you want to bring in before the end of time?
Yeah, we've got a few minutes remaining. So there's 3 questions in here, which I might put 2 to you very quickly and then come back to you for your final thoughts as well, because it sort of relates to as a final wrap-up thought, I think. So the first 2, one is going to be from an anonymous attendee, just sort of saying, Rachel, how do you feel about the rainbow lanyard branding being used for COVID this year instead of for Pride? Following up very quickly with a question about how were the volunteers involved at each of the chosen properties for Prejudice and Pride? And then when you've answered that, I'll come with the third.
I missed the first question, so I'll start with the second about volunteers.
Sorry,
which was
yes.
That's okay. Which was around, and the answer to that is very differently. Each property did approach the theme very, very differently. Some properties like Sutton House that had this fantastic Sean Curran there to lead programming, really embraced the theme, and it ran throughout the entire year. Some did more tentative installations. At Kingston Lacey, the artists and Leicester team worked very closely with volunteers, and I showed a picture of it in memoriam, the rope lanyards, and the team actually worked with volunteers to record a soundscape of the names of each of the men who lost their lives, and that they were spoken by volunteers. And just by bringing volunteers into the process as early as possible throughout all of these, again with Hanbury, volunteers got involved in Tom's performance, and by involving volunteers in those kind of ways, I mean, the teams that did that certainly did best with their volunteers and had kind of the most enjoyable experience of it. And then what was the first question, Dan?
First question was to do with rainbow branding being used by the National Trust this year for COVID instead of for Pride. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Oh, I'm not sure. I think that's passed me by. I don't know whether that was something that happened when I was on fellow or what. But yeah, obviously the rainbow lanyards have been hugely controversial in some very small quarters. I think it's really important to say. What I've been aware of coming up with rainbow lanyards this year is that they featured again in the last few months. They were back on the front page of the Telegraph as the National Trust started to look at histories of slavery and colonialism, and the Telegraph particularly is really, taking a very active attack on that kind of inclusive histories program, what they see is kind of PC woke program. And I think, in their first article on it, I think it was the second paragraph, rainbow lanyards came up again as a sort of, this is the problem with the National Trust, that they're looking to do this. So I think it's good that they're still live and still going, because they are still under pressure to not be there. So yeah, but I can't speak to the COVID thing because I have not been involved in that. I'm sorry.
This might allow you to sort of refocus back to Prejudice and Pride, which is sort of what's happening in the future, but also how will some of the interpretation or the stories or the performances that David created for us, how will they be continued to be preserved at the different locations?
That's a really, really good question. I suppose that speaks to legacy as well, which is the thing that I highlighted right at the start. Again, in all honesty, it's kind of a mixed picture. This Prejudice and Pride has had a huge impact on the National Trust. It transformed since the start of the programme. There was no dedicated time or resource to anything to do with diversity and inclusion in the organisation. Now we have diversity and inclusion are part of the values of the organisation, where they went before. We have staff. A lot of the legacy of Prejudice and Pride actually does run through the whole Inclusive Histories programme, and I think I am seeing a lot of it in the decolonising work that's happening now. So there's that kind of that half of the legacy. In terms of very specific LGBTQ projects, that we have a few bids in for different things, and in fact one with David and Richard, again hoping to work looking at Black queer lives with some of the other partners involved in this symposium. One of the big legacies, I think, from the programme has been actually creating this network, and that the National Trust taking the time to sort of work with Lucy, a fantastic PhD student, to write the original bid to go to Art Fund with the other partners to bring it to life. So yeah, it's been patchy in terms of kind of delivery projects. Hopefully it will kind of continue to step up in the next couple of years.
That's everything. So I think we're at time. So maybe if we had some reflections, some final thoughts from both you and David about what you leave behind in a way, and the impact that you hope this will continue to make. Maybe Rachel first, and then David.
Yeah. And I suppose I kind of touched on quite a lot of it there in terms of the impact that this work can have beyond just queering sort of histories and collections, across looking at who you are as an organisation and becoming more inclusive, looking at things like workforce and values, who you are, who you want to include. I think that's really important. And then beyond queer past lives into other lives that have been suppressed in the past, and that we don't see reflected appropriately in our collections and interpretation. I think for me, one of the things one of the unexpected outcomes of this has been that kind of wider work, and the way that Prejudice and Pride has been able to stimulate all of this other stuff outside of just queer histories. And I think it is just about continuing to ask kind of whose voices are we hearing now, whose voices are we not hearing, and addressing those gaps very, very actively. I think that's probably the last thing I would say. David, do you have anything about your experience of the National Trust or anything to add to that?
I had a great time working with the National Trust. Somebody called Steve Lennon just wrote in and said that it was nice to see how my work was developing, and I just want to chime back to that and say, yeah, thank you, Stephen. It has actually given me a new career altogether. I still do make records, but actually, since I worked with the National Trust, I've been able to take new works to new places, and it just seems like a really good thing to work towards, to create works about art and about collections and about lives lived, about historical lives lived, and to build performances for those spaces around that, because my experience is that you can get more diverse audiences into spaces by speaking about those spaces in a different way, in a way that people might not expect, so that it's not for a particular sector that it's perceived for, but actually for everybody. And that's why I've been. That's why I've lectured at the National Portrait Gallery. That's why I've worked with the Wallace Collection as well, because of this work and with the National Trust.
Great, thank you. Great, so thank you for joining us, David. It's been great to revisit that project. And so I think I might take the opportunity there, Dan, to just thank everyone for joining us. Thank you again, Dan, for pulling the whole symposium together.